This is a slow, made-up, another-world fantasy. A hero condemned for one uncomfortable truth. Alongside loyal friends who protect him, listen for one gentle request he cannot refuse. Close your eyes now and let this quiet, make-believe world carry you gently to sleep. Somewhere beneath the old castle, in a cell with no window and only a little light, a man named Haruto had long since stopped counting the days. He knew it had been weeks, many of them, though the exact number had slipped away from him the way water slips through loosely closed fingers. Haruto sat with his back against the damp stone wall of the dungeon, his wrists loose now inside manacles the guards no longer bothered to check, and he waited the way he had waited for longer than he could easily remember, for nothing in particular. His legs had long ago learned the particular ache of stone, a dull and patient pain that lived in his knees and did not so much hurt as simply remind him over and over exactly where he was. Long ago, before any of this, the people of this land had called him a hero and had sent him out into the world to kill a demon king. Now the same people called him a traitor, and it was this word, more than the stone or the cold, that Haruto had never quite learned how to carry. If he closed his eyes, even now, he could still feel himself kneeling on the cold stone of a hall so tall that its ceiling was lost in the dark above the torches, in front of a king and the men who kept his records and never once looked up from them, telling them the plain truth that the demon king did not exist, that there never had been one at all. He remembered the silence that followed, how it went on a moment too long, how one of the men had set down his pen very slowly, as if the small sound of it might matter. He did not know yet, in that memory, what the silence meant. He would find out soon enough, but not yet, not in this small and stubborn corner of his mind where he still stood in that room, before anything had been decided. But that was later, and this was now, and the now of it was a cell and a cold of stone that had long since given up trying to be anything other than cold. A thin line of gray light came in through a crack somewhere above him, more felt than seen, and by it he had learned to tell morning from evening, which was, these days, nearly all he needed to know. Somewhere far off, water dripped against stone in a rhythm so steady that Haruto had stopped hearing it as sound, and had started hearing it, instead, as a kind of company. The air down here smelled the way it always did, of old straw and older stone, and somewhere underneath that, faint and almost gone, of the rain that must have fallen far above him that afternoon, finding its way down through cracks he would never see. In the stillness he could hear his own breathing, and beneath that, if he sat quiet enough, the slow, patient beat of his own heart, and he had come, in the time since, to find something almost steadying in the fact that it still went on keeping its own small time, regardless of anything the world above had decided about him. Long before the cell, before the trial, before any of the words that had put him here, Haruto had been an ordinary young man from an ordinary town, the kind of place with a well in the square and a shrine on the hill, and nothing much to tell one quiet year from the next. Then the officials came, with their banners and their careful voices, and told him that the land was in danger, that somewhere far away a demon king had risen, and that he, Haruto, had been chosen to end it. He remembered how it had felt to be chosen, the warmth of it, almost embarrassing in how simply and how completely it had filled him up. He remembered, too, the small things from that day. The way the banners had set in the wind, he could still almost feel the weight of a cloak settled onto his shoulders by hands that were not his own, and the faces of people he had known his whole life looking at him as though he had become, in a single afternoon, someone else entirely. They gave him a sword too heavy for his hands at first, and a title too large for a boy who had never once left his own province. And they sent him out into the world with a small company of others who had been chosen in that same breath. He did not think of them often now, the ones who had walked beside him through those years, but when he did, it was always with a tenderness that surprised him, given everything that came after. Together they crossed rivers that had no bridges and climbed mountains that had no names on any map he ever saw, and everywhere they went, people came out of their houses to look at them the way people look at weather, with hope and a little fear mixed together. He remembered the particular tiredness of those years in his body more clearly. Sometimes, then he remembered the faces, the blisters that had turned to calluses, the cold of 100 campfires that never quite reached his back, the way his shoulders had learned to carry a pack the way other men's shoulders learn to carry nothing at all. For years, that was the whole of his life, walking, fighting, resting, and walking again, the seasons turning over his head like pages in a book he had slowly stopped reading closely. There are creatures out there, real ones that the towns called monsters, and Haruto and his company met them on lonely roads and in the mouths of dark caves, and did what they had been sent out to do. He did not like to remember the particulars of those fights, only that there were many of them, and that with each one he told himself the same quiet thing, that it was necessary, that it was for the Demon King, that it would all end the day the Demon King was finally found. His hands had changed over those years in ways he had never quite noticed happening. The softness of the well-square boy worn away into something harder, more certain, more used to the weight of a hilt than the weight of anything gentler. The trouble was that the Demon King was never found, not in the first year, and not in the 5th, and not in the 10th, and slowly, the way frost creeps in under a door before anyone notices the cold, a different kind of question had begun to settle into Haruto. No one he ever met in all those years had actually seen this Demon King. The old records his company was sent to study did not agree with one another, not on a name, not on a face, not even on which mountain the creature was meant to be sleeping under. And when he asked why, the answers he got were always kind and always a little too smooth. There had been nights in those later years when he lay awake long after the others had gone quiet around the fire, turning some map or ledger over in his hands by poor light, looking for a single fact that would hold still and agree with another fact, and never quite finding one. He would later come to feel that this was the moment the whole shape of his life had quietly begun to change, though at the time it felt like nothing at all, only a small itch of doubt he could not quite reach far enough to scratch. Still, he kept walking because that was what a hero did, and because he did not yet have the courage, or perhaps the cruelty, to carry the question all the way to its end. It took him a long time to say it out loud, much longer than it should have, and when he finally did, it was not on some battlefield and not in front of the people who loved him. It was in that same torchlit hall, the one he still returned to sometimes with his eyes closed, on his knees in front of officials who kept ledgers instead of swords, that he finally told the truth all the way through. He told them that after years of searching, there was no demon king left to find, that the creature had never existed at all, and that it seemed, as far as he and his company could tell, to have been invented long ago by people who had found it useful to have an enemy. He remembered thinking, as he said it, that he was handing them a gift, a kind of freedom, the chance to stop sending young men and women out to bleed for a monster that had only ever been a story. He was wrong about that, though it would take him one more day to learn exactly how wrong, and the learning of it would arrive from the palace in language as calm and as careful as a notice about taxes. There was no demon king. That was all he had said, 5 plain words, and he would spend a long time afterward turning them over, trying to understand how so small a sentence had led to so large an ending. He thought, sitting in the dark of the cell so long afterward, that if he had known, he might still have said it, though he was never entirely sure, and he had learned by now not to trust himself too much on that particular question. That was the story of how a hero came to be locked away beneath the very castle he had once been sent out from, and it was, Haruto thought, a strange kind of homecoming, the sort no one writes songs about. In the first days of his imprisonment, he had been furious in a way that frightened even him, a hatred so large it had felt like it belonged to someone else, and a grief right alongside it that he could never quite separate from the anger, however he tried. He did not think that anger or that grief would ever fully leave him. In a strange way, he had stopped wanting them to, because by now they were some of the only company he had left. But the weeks in the dark had done what weeks in the dark tend to do, and slowly, without his noticing the exact day it happened, the fury had banked itself down into something quieter, something closer to a low, steady coal than a fire. He still thought, some nights, about the ones who had traveled with him, about their voices and their small habits. The way one of them had always hummed softly while walking, and the way another had never once let a conversation end unkindly if there was any way to end it gently instead. He did not know, from inside this cell, what had become of any of them, and some part of him had made an uneasy peace with not knowing, the way a person makes peace with a door they are not yet ready to open. Sometimes, without meaning to, he would catch the ghost of wood smoke on air that could not possibly hold any, or the memory of a particular laugh from a particular evening years gone, and he had learned to let those visits come and go without chasing after them too hard. The drip of water went on somewhere above him, patient as ever, and Haruto found himself thinking, not for the first time, that a man could get used to almost anything, given enough years and little enough choice in the matter. He no longer asked himself whether the world outside still believed in the Demon King, or in the hero who was supposed to have failed to find one. He only asked on the quietest nights whether the boy from the little town with the well in the square would still recognize the man who now sat here. And mostly he thought the answer was no, and mostly he thought that was all right. So he sat, as he had sat for longer than he cared to count, his back against the cold stone, his breathing slow and even, and let all of it be what it was, neither forgiven nor forgotten, only carried, the way a stone is carried, quietly, and without much complaint. The manacles rested loose and familiar around his wrists now, more habit than restraint, and he had stopped noticing their weight the way a person stops noticing the weight of their own hands. The dark down here was not an empty dark, not anymore, but a kind of soft and known dark, the way a room a person has slept in for years grows kind to them, whatever it looked like to anyone standing in the doorway. Outside, far above the dungeon, the castle he had once been sent out from went on with its ordinary evening, its lamps lit one by one, its guards changing shifts, none of it troubled, tonight, by the man still sitting in the dark below. And Haruto, for his part, closed his eyes and let the slow drip of water carry him, gently, toward whatever thin sleep the dungeon was willing to give him that night. Let that moment rest for now. There is no need to hold on to it too tightly, no need to follow every thought to its end. It can simply settle the way a held breath finally lets go. The night is still gentle around it, unhurried, patient, and the story is not finished, only pausing to breathe alongside you. If your eyes have grown heavy, that is all right. You can let them close for a moment and still be here, still be carried along. Take a slow breath in and a slower one out. Nothing is asked of you now but to rest. And when you're ready, or even if you are already drifting, we can stay together as the same night continues on, quietly, softly, into what comes next. In the long stone hall of the capital, a young man named Haruto knelt before the throne, the road's dust still on his knees, and told the king, as plainly as he knew how, that there was no demon king. He had walked the length of the world to say those 5 words, and now that the moment had finally come, they felt smaller than he had imagined. No thunder in them at all, only breath, and the faint smell of cold stone and lamp oil that had been the same in every great hall he had ever knelt in. There was no throne of ash at the world's far edge, he said, no army massing in some smoking valley, nothing but ordinary land, and small villages who had spent their whole lives afraid of an enemy none of them had ever actually seen. The hall went very quiet. Somewhere above him, high in the vaulted dark, a moth circled one of the wall torches, and Haruto found himself watching it rather than the throne, because it was easier, just then, than watching the king's face change. It had taken him 3 years just to make the journey back. 3 years of frozen passes and river crossings and roads that were sometimes no more than a suggestion in the grass. And in all that time, he had rehearsed this moment so many ways that the real one, now that it had arrived, felt almost too plain to be happening at all. The king was a man named Takashi, not old, though he wore the weariness of the crown the way older men wear a cane, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, only turned the signet ring on his finger once and then again, the small gold sound of it the only thing moving in the whole vast room. Along the walls, in their long dark coats, the lords of the court stood and did not move either, though Haruto could feel, more than see, the way their attention had sharpened, the particular stillness of people doing arithmetic behind still faces. One of them, an older man near the back, closed his eyes briefly, the way a person does when they have just heard something they already somewhere suspected. Haruto went on, because it seemed cruel to stop now, and told the court about the years on the road, the swamps that smelled of standing water and rot, the frozen passes where his companions had once burned the last of their firewood just to keep a kettle from freezing solid, the villages that fed him more out of fear than kindness, small bowls of thin soup pressed into his hands by people who wanted, more than anything, for him to be on his way again soon and take whatever danger he represented with him. He told them, too, about the things called monsters, the low howling shapes in the tree line, the pale things that lived in caves and only ever attacked when cornered, and how he and his companions had hunted them and driven them off, and more than once killed them, in the name of a war that it now seemed no one had actually ever been fighting. He remembered, though he did not say it aloud in the hall, one particular den in a hillside far to the north, and the sound that had come from inside it after the fighting stopped, and how he had told himself for a long time afterward that it was only the wind. He did not enjoy saying any of this. He said it anyway, because a hero he had always believed was supposed to be the one person in the room willing to tell the truth, even when the truth was heavy, even when it would have been so much easier, so much kinder to everyone, including himself, to simply let the old story stand. Beside the throne stood the king's chancellor, a narrow, careful man named Daichi, who had not moved or spoken through any of it, and who was watching Haruto now with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear, but something colder that seemed to sit underneath both, the look of a man already several steps further down a road no one else in the room had noticed yet. It was Daichi, in the end, who thanked Haruto for his honesty, in a voice so even it could have been reciting a shopping list, and told him the crown would need time to consider carefully what he had brought them. Consider, Haruto thought, was a strange word for the truth, as though it were a piece of cloth that might or might not suit the room. But he was tired in the particular way that goes past the legs and settles into the bones, the kind of tired that makes a person accept almost anything if it means being allowed, finally, to sit down somewhere quiet. So he only bowed and did not ask what exactly there was left to consider. He was shown to a small stone chamber off the east corridor to wait out the night, a narrow bed against one wall, a narrower window cut high near the ceiling, a jug of water, and a single candle already burning low. And he was told, kindly enough, that the king's answer would come by morning. He did not sleep. He sat instead on the edge of the narrow bed with his boots still on, listening to the castle settle around him the way old buildings do at night, stone ticking faintly as it cooled, some far-off door closing, a guard's footsteps crossing the corridor below and fading into nothing, and he thought of all things about how quiet the world had always been underneath all that noise about monsters. Somewhere in another wing of the castle, he knew, his companions were waiting through this same long night in rooms much like his own, and he found a small, tired comfort in that, in not being the only one lying awake with the truth still ringing faintly in his ears like a bell struck once and left to fade. He thought about the years, then the way a person does when there is nothing left to do but wait. Not in any order, but in pieces, the frozen mountain pass where the wind had cut through every layer he owned, the river crossing where he had nearly drowned, and his companions had pulled him out laughing with relief once they knew he was breathing. The village elder who had wept and pressed dried fish into his hands as thanks for killing something that, it turned out, had only ever wanted to be, left alone in its own home. He thought about the first months of the journey, too, when the word hero had still felt like a coat that fit him, warm and a little too large, the kind of coat a boy grows into. Somewhere between that first winter and this one, without his ever quite noticing the change, the coat had stopped feeling large and started feeling heavy instead, and he could not now say exactly which mountain pass or which burned-out village had done it. He wondered, not for the first time that night, what exactly it was they had all been sent out to fight. And he found, turning it over and over in the candlelight, that he did not have an answer that made the wondering stop. Near dawn, when the window above him had gone from black to the deep gray that comes just before color returns to the world, he heard footsteps in the corridor that did not fade the way the others had all night, footsteps that came closer instead, and then stopped outside his door. Daichi came in without much ceremony, holding a scroll closed with a disc of wax stamped with the crown's own crest, and Haruto noticed, in the strange sideways way the mind notices small things at large moments, that the Chancellor's hands were not quite steady as he broke the seal. The decree, when it was finally read to him, was not long. It said that the peace of the realm rested on the memory of a great evil once defeated. Generations of ordinary people, it went on, had built their comfort, their harvests, their small, unremarkable lives on the quiet belief that someone, somewhere had stood between them and the dark so that they would never have to. A truth that served no one and only frightened everyone was not, in the end, the same thing as a kindness, the decree read, and the crown had a duty to protect its people even from facts that did them no good. And then it said, at the very end, in the same even court language usually kept for taxes and treaties and the sealing of roads, that Haruto and his companions, having gone out to find the Demon King and returned instead with nothing but an empty world, were to be put to death quietly, so that the peace they had broken simply by speaking might be mended before word of it could spread any further. To protect the lie was what it meant, though the scroll itself never once used that particular word. Haruto found that he was not, in the first moment, afraid. He was only very still, the way a person goes still after stepping wrong on a stair in the dark, that half second of nothing before the body catches up to what the mind already knows. He asked quietly whether the king himself had signed it, and Daichi told him that he had, that very morning, before the sun was properly up, and that he had not looked pleased about it, for whatever that was worth in a room like this one. It was worth very little, and they both seemed to know it. Haruto thought again of every village that had fed him, every elder who had thanked him with dried fish and old blankets and small worn coins pressed into his palm, every creature he had driven from a home it had only ever been defending, and he understood, all at once and much too late, exactly what kind of war he had actually been sent out to fight. Not a war against some king of demons who had never existed at all, but a slower, quieter war to keep a comfortable old story standing upright. Whatever the story ended up costing the people who had actually lived it. He had simply never once imagined that the cost, in the end, would be him. Him and the people who had walked every mile of it beside him. Daichi did not meet his eyes again after that, and Haruto found, strangely, that he did not hate him for it, because the Chancellor was only one more tired man doing what the crown required of him. In a kingdom built, it turned out, on precisely the same kind of obedience Haruto himself had spent his whole life practicing without ever once questioning it. There did not seem to be much use, anyway, in arguing with a scroll. They took him down, not long after, through the old part of the castle, where the stones stopped being smooth and polished and started being simply old, worn round at the corners by centuries of hands and boots, down a narrow stair that grew colder with every turn until his breath began to show faintly in the torchlight. The cell they put him in was small and dry, and had clearly held other people before him, generations of them, judging by the marks scratched low into the wall near the door, small tallies in uneven rows, a few initials, and in one corner, low to the floor, a single crude drawing of the sun. Someone once a long time before him had wanted very badly to remember what daylight looked like. Haruto sat down against the far wall, where the stone was driest, and listened to the guard's footsteps climb back up the stair and out of hearing, and then to nothing at all, the particular nothing of a place built on purpose to keep sound from carrying anywhere. The floor was cold enough to feel through his clothes, and he found he did not mind it much, the way a person stops minding small discomforts once a much larger one has arrived to stand beside them. He looked down at his own hands for a while, the calluses from years of a sword hilt, a thin white scar across one knuckle from some fight he could no longer place, and thought that they looked, in the low torchlight, like the hands of a much older man than the one who had first left home, believing so simply in the word hero. He was not, he realized slowly, angry at the villages or the elders or even really at the king, who had after all only done what kings have always done to keep the peace looking peaceful from the outside. What he felt instead was something quieter and heavier than anger, a kind of grief that had no clear edge to it, grief for every creature he had ever driven from its own home in the name of a danger that had only ever lived inside a story someone else had needed very badly to be true. Somewhere above him, in other cells much like his own, he knew his companions were sitting now with this same news settling over them. And he found himself hoping, in the small, useless way a person hopes for things that have already been decided, that none of them were quite as alone with it as he felt in that moment. The torch out in the corridor burned low and steady, throwing a thin orange line under the door that did not flicker, did not hurry, did not seem to know or care what the coming morning would bring to any of them. And Haruto, condemned now for nothing more than telling the truth he had been sent out into the world to find, sat in the quiet dark of the old stone room and let his eyes close, not because he had made his peace with what was coming, but because there was, for tonight at least, nothing left to do but wait for it, the same as everyone else in that castle, honest or otherwise. And somewhere above him, the last of the candle in his old room would be guttering out on its own, unwatched, into the gray coming light. Let that moment rest for now, just as it was. There's no need to hurry away from it. No need to tidy it into a neat little ending. It can simply stay there, quiet, while the night goes on around it. Somewhere close by, the same story keeps breathing gently forward, the way a house keeps settling after everyone is gone still. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. Nothing here needs to be caught or held onto. Just let your breath go slow and even in and out like a tide easing back from the shore. We are not leaving anyone behind. We are only moving a little further into the same quiet dark, the same unfinished night, carrying this one story with us softly into what comes next. Somewhere beneath the old castle, in a low stone cell that had not seen real daylight in longer than he could count, a man named Haruto woke to the sound of morning arriving. He understood, without anyone needing to tell him, that this was the day the guards meant to call his dear friend Yui's name before they ever came for his own. Yui was the sage of their small company, the healer, the quiet keeper of old scripture, and she had walked at his side since she was 16 years old. 2 doors down the corridor, in the cell they had put her in, he could hear her moving about in the straw, slow and unhurried, as though she had already made whatever peace a person makes on a morning like this one. He had not. He lay a while longer on the thin straw mat, his wrists still ringed pale from the irons, and watched the gray light climb the wall the way water finds the low places in a floor. The cell smelled of wet stone and old iron, a smell he had stopped noticing weeks ago the way a person stops noticing their own tiredness. And somewhere far off, muffled by all that stone, a bell told the hour, slow and heavy, the sound rolling down through the castle like something poured rather than wrung. His feet had been bare so long that the cold of the floor had become simply a fact of his body now. The way hunger had, the way thirst had, small companions he had learned to carry without complaint. There was nothing else in that cell to do but remember, so he let himself remember. He remembered a girl of 16 standing at the edge of a village whose name he had long since lost, too small still for the sage's robes the temple had given her. She had been holding a satchel of bandages and dried herbs against her chest as though it might steady her heart, and she had volunteered, before anyone thought to ask her, to be the one who walked beside him. In those first years on the road, she was always the one who woke earliest and slept latest, boiling water before dawn so his blisters could be tended before the walking began again. If he ever thanked her for it, she would only say, softly, that a sage's hand were made for exactly this and little else. She had a way of folding her own worry into some pocket and forgetting where she had put it. Even after a battle left her own arm shaking, she would kneel first beside whichever of them was hurt worse, murmuring the old healing words until the tremor in her voice matched the one in her hands. He used to tell her, more than once, that she ought to think of herself now and then. She would only smile in that small, tired way of hers and admit that she had thought about it and decided against it. It was not, he understood now, lying with his eyes on the ceiling, that fear had never touched her. It was that somewhere long before he ever met her, she had quietly decided that other people's fear mattered more than her own, and she had never once gone back on it. He thought of the winter the frost came early, when their company had nearly starved crossing the mountains, and how she had given half her own ration to him without a single word about it. When he noticed the bowl was wrong, she had told him only that sages ate less in the cold, which was not a true thing at all, and which he had believed anyway, because he wanted to. He thought of the night before the words came that ended everything, when she had sat outside his door in the dark for reasons she never once explained, and he had not asked her why. Some kindnesses he had learned from her are better left unquestioned. He thought of an evening beside a low fire, years before any of this, when she had pressed a cup of something bitter and warm into his hands and told him, quietly, that it was a tea her grandmother used to make for frightened children, and that she supposed a hero was allowed to be frightened sometimes too. He remembered laughing at that, really laughing, for what felt like the first time in months, and she had looked so pleased with herself that he had teased her about it for a week afterward. He remembered, too, the one time he had seen her cry, after a village they had meant to save had already been lost by the time they arrived, when she had knelt in the ash and admitted, in a voice barely above a breath, that she did not understand why their prayers so often seemed to arrive too late. He had not had an answer for her then, and lying in the cell now, he understood that he still did not. She had always kept a small dried flower, some pale mountain blossom, pressed flat inside the cover of her prayer book, and she would never tell him where it came from, only smile when he asked, as though it were a secret too small and too precious to spend on an answer. He wondered, lying there, whether she still had it, whether they had let her keep even that much. These were the things he found himself remembering, not the battles, not the long roads, not even the day the terrible truth had first been spoken aloud, but small things, a cup of tea, a pressed flower, the sound of her laughing at her own joke before he had even finished telling his. He thought that perhaps this was what a person's mind did. At the end of things, reach for the smallest kindnesses first, because the smallest kindnesses were the ones that had never once asked anything of him in return. He was still turning that thought over, slow and unhurried, when a sound reached him from far up the corridor. It was faint at first, the kind of sound a tired man could mistake for his own heartbeat, and he lay very still and let it resolve into what it actually was. Footsteps, several pairs of them, moving without hurry down the long stone stair. He had heard those footsteps before, twice, in the long gray weeks since the door of the cell had closed on him. Always they had gone somewhere else, always for someone in a different corridor, and each time he had felt the small, guilty relief of a man spared for one more day. Each time, he had hated himself a little for feeling it. This time the footsteps did not pass his door. This time they slowed, and then they stopped, and he heard the sound that had come to mean more to him than any other sound in the world. It was the small, patient business of a key finding its lock. Down the corridor, he heard Yui go still, just for a moment, the way a person goes still when they have been listening as carefully as he had been. Neither of them said anything at all for a long moment, and the only sound in the whole cold hallway was that one key turning over and over in someone's hand. A voice near the stairs read a name aloud, unhurried, almost bored, the way a clerk might read from a delivery list, and the name it read was hers. Haruto came up off the straw before he had even decided to move, and the chain at his ankle went taut and bit into the bone as he pressed himself against the bars of his own cell, straining to see into hers. The angle gave him almost nothing, only a slice of gray light and the edge of a shoulder rising to stand. He heard himself say her name, low and cracked, not loud enough to be called anything but a whisper. Through the narrow gap where the bars did not quite meet the stone, he caught a glimpse of her passing, her sage's robe gone gray and thin with weeks of dust. Her hair hung loose now, because they had taken the ribbon she used to tie it back with weeks ago, and for one moment, in the dark, her eyes found his. She did not look afraid, or if she was, she had folded it away the way she had always folded such things away. What he saw in her face instead was a kind of terrible, gentle patience, the look of someone who had decided not to make this harder for the person left watching her go. She told him, in a voice pitched just for him, barely above a breath, not to do anything foolish. She reminded him, gently, that the two of them had lived through worse mornings than this one, though he could hear, even as she said it, that she did not fully believe her own words. He understood that she was saying them for him and not for herself. He wanted to tell her 100 things at once, that none of it, not the false god, not the false war, was worth what it had already cost her. His throat closed around all of it, and what came out instead was only her name again, and the useless scrape of a chain against stone as he reached for bars that would not open. A hand took her by the arm, not unkindly, only indifferently, and turned her toward the stairs. She went because there was nothing else a person chained by circumstance rather than iron could do but go. Going quietly, he understood even then, was its own small act of care toward the person left behind. Beyond the stairwell, where he could no longer see, lay the long corridor that climbed toward the castle's outer hall. One he remembered walking once as a hero returning rather than a prisoner, listening from below. He remembered that corridor hung with old banners the color of dried blood and gold, banners bearing the same royal crest that had once, in another lifetime, been stitched onto a cloak they draped over his own shoulders the day the kingdom first called him hero, and he wondered distantly whether those banners still hung there now. It seemed a strange thing to wonder about in that moment, and yet the mind reached for strange things when it could not bear to reach for the true one. High windows there let in a cold, colorless morning light he could only imagine now, lying in the dark and following the sound of her footsteps as they climbed away from him. He counted the steps out of some old habit from the road, the way he used to count distances and days and the towns left before winter, because counting was easier than thinking. Somewhere around the 20th step, her footsteps folded into the footsteps of the guards around her and grew indistinguishable from any other sound in the castle. He told himself this did not mean anything yet. A name called first was not the same as a thing already finished, and he had seen delays before, arguments among guards over paperwork and order, small mercies of a slow and clumsy bureaucracy that had nothing to do with mercy at all. He remembered, or tried to, every past morning that had frightened him half this much and had still, somehow, ended with her walking back through a door, tired, already asking after his own scrapes before she would let anyone tend to hers. He made himself believe it, because the alternative was not a thing he could hold. Somewhere above him, a door opened, heavy and far away, and a gust of outside air came down through the stairwell and reached even his cell. It carried with it the low murmur of a crowd, not large, not loud, only the quiet sound of a town square gathered on a gray morning, waiting. A thin, cold rain must have begun somewhere above, because a few moments later he heard the faint patter of it finding the high windows, soft and indifferent, the kind of rain that does not care at all what morning it happens to be falling on. He found something almost bitter in that indifference, and then, just as readily, something almost comforting in it too, because a world that went on raining regardless was a world that had not yet decided anything for certain. He pressed his forehead against the cold bars and closed his eyes, and in the dark behind them he found her again at 16, satchel of bandages held to her chest. In his mind, she was deciding again, before anyone had asked her to, that she would be the one who walked beside him. He thought that if he held on to that girl closely enough, the way she used to hum some half-remembered temple song while she worked, off-key, and never once embarrassed by it, he might hold the morning back a little longer. It did not work, not really. He kept trying anyway, because trying was the one thing left inside that cell that still belonged to him. Her footsteps, or what he told himself were her footsteps, had gone quiet now somewhere above, swallowed by the murmur of the square and the slow, heavy shifting of the door. He sat with his back against the stone and his chained hands loose in his lap, listening for anything at all that might tell him what was happening to her. This was the person who had spent 11 years making sure nothing ever happened to him. Somewhere in that long silence, he found himself praying, clumsily, to whichever gods might still be listening after everything his company had learned about them. Not for victory, not even for justice, only that when he next heard a voice from that stairwell, it would be hers. He did not know how long he knelt there with his forehead against the bars, only that his knees had gone numb against the stone long before his mind allowed him to notice the cold. No sound came. He stayed exactly where he was because there was nowhere else in that cell to go, and he let the dread sit in his chest the way cold water settles into a low place in the ground, patient and unhurried, finding every corner it could reach. He did not know, in that gray and unmoving hour, whether the next sound he heard would carry her voice again, or carry nothing of her at all. That not knowing, for now, was the whole of the world he had left to him. Let that moment rest for now, just as it was. There's no need to hurry past it. No need to hold on to it too tightly, either. It can simply settle, the way a held breath finally lets go. We stay with them a little longer, here in the quiet part of the night, where nothing more needs to be decided just yet. If your eyes have grown heavy, that is all right. You do not have to keep them open. The story is still unfolding around you, softly, the way a house settles once everyone inside has gone quiet, and there is more still to come. whenever you are ready to drift with it. For now, just breathe, slow and easy, and let the night carry you forward. In a stone cell beneath the old castle, a man named Haruto sat with his wrists bound in coarse rope, listening for footsteps he already knew were coming for him. The window above him was barely wider than his own two hands, and through it came only a sliver of night sky. No moon that he could see, just a deep, unhelpful blue. The cell 2 doors down had stood empty since morning, the straw inside it undisturbed, and Haruto had made himself stop looking at it somewhere around midday. He was still turned toward the corridor, waiting when the sound came, slow, and even on the wet flagstones, the sound of one man in no particular hurry. Haruto had heard that walk before, twice now, and both times it had meant that someone he knew would not be coming back down this corridor again. He tried to stand and found that his legs, after a night with no sleep and a morning with no food, felt further away than legs should feel. The rope at his wrists had rubbed the skin raw somewhere in the last few hours, though he found he could barely feel it anymore, the way a person stops feeling cold once they're cold enough. Before the footsteps reached his door, though, a voice spoke from the next cell over, close enough that the cold of the shared wall came through Haruto's shoulder. It belonged to a warrior named Kenji, a broad, plain-spoken man Haruto had walked beside for the better part of 11 years, and had never once heard sound afraid. Haruto thought, in the small, strange way the mind wanders even in a moment like that one, of a river crossing years before, high with spring melt, where Kenji had simply picked him up under one arm and waded across without asking whether he wanted the help. He thought, too, of Kenji's cooking, famously bad, and of how Kenji had always served everyone else first anyway, plate after plate, before he ever sat down to his own burnt share. Kenji said, in the same flat voice he used for ordering supper or reporting a monster's weak point, that the executioner had the order of things wrong today. He said it was his turn first, actually, and that everyone would save themselves some trouble if the guards simply came and unlocked his door instead of Haruto's. The footsteps paused. A man named Riku stepped into view then, the castle's executioner, a broad-shouldered man with a ring of keys at his belt and the unbothered look of someone who had done this many times before. Riku glanced between the two cells for a moment, the way a man checks a ledger before deciding which debt to collect first, and then, with a shrug, he turned toward Kenji's door instead. It was, Haruto would think later, such a small thing to hinge a life on, that shrug, that little change of direction, and yet everything after it happened because of it. Riku unlocked the cell and stepped inside without much caution, the rope already looped and ready in one hand, the keys still hanging loose from the other. Haruto pressed himself against the bars separating the two cells, unable to do anything with his own bound hands but watch. And for a moment, the only sound in the whole block was the torch on the far wall, hissing softly where damp had gotten into it. What happened in the next few seconds was not something Haruto watched closely, and it is not something this story needs to look at closely either. It is enough to say that a man with his wrist bound can still use his shoulder, his weight, and 11 years of knowing exactly where a body is weakest and that Kenji did. It is enough to say that Riku went down hard against the stone, and that for a moment the whole corridor held its breath along with him, dust drifting down from between the ceiling stones as if the castle itself had felt it. Kenji did not waste the moment admiring it, and Haruto would remember always how unhurried he still looked even then, as if this were one more chore in a long day of chores. He knelt, rope still binding his own wrists, and worked the ring of keys free from Riku's belt with fingers that did not shake at all. Then he straightened, turned toward the bars between the two cells, and threw the keys through them. Underhand, easy, the way a man tosses something he trusts the other person to catch. For just a moment, across that narrow gap between the bars, their eyes met, and Kenji's mouth did something that was almost, though not quite, a smile, the way it always looked when he was about to say something he thought was obvious. Haruto caught them. He would remember the weight of that iron ring in his bound hands more clearly than almost anything else from that day. Heavier than it had any right to be, warm from Riku's belt. His fingers were clumsy with the rope and with the shaking that had started somewhere in his chest, and it took him 3 tries to find a key that fit his own lock. When the door finally gave, he did not stop to feel any relief in it, because relief was a thing for later, if there was going to be a later at all. Down the row, other locks were turning too, quick and quiet, and the corridor filled with the soft sound of people who had been sitting still for too long finally starting to move. Nobody spoke much. There was a kind of understanding among people who had traveled together as long as they had, that speaking now would only cost time none of them had. Somewhere behind him in the dark, one freed prisoner reached back to help another to their feet. A small, wordless kindness passed between 2 people who did not have breath to spare for anything more. Haruto turned back toward Kenji's cell to find him already braced in the doorway, one boot planted against the frame, watching the far end of the corridor rather than the door he had just opened. That was when Riku got up. He rose the way certain men always do, slower than you would like, angrier than before, wiping something from his mouth with the back of one hand and reaching for the short blade at his hip. Kenji stepped between him and the corridor without seeming to decide to do it, the way a person steps in front of a falling cup before they have thought about catching it. He told Haruto, without turning around, that the others should go on ahead, and that he would follow along himself soon enough, once he had finished here. He said it so plainly, so much like a man commenting on the weather, that for one strange moment Haruto almost believed it was going to be that simple. Haruto hesitated in the doorway of the cell block, the freed ring of keys still in his hand, and asked, in a voice that came out smaller than he meant it to, whether Kenji was certain. Kenji did not look back at him, and he answered slowly, almost gently for a man built the way he was, that Haruto should stop asking questions and start walking, because a door like this one did not stay open for long. He added, and this was the last thing Haruto heard him say clearly before the corridor swallowed the rest, that he had never once broken a promise in 11 years of traveling together, and did not plan to start on the day it mattered most. The stone passage beyond the cell block ran uphill, narrow and low enough that Haruto had to duck his head twice, and it smelled of damp moss and old iron, the smell every dungeon seems to share. Cold air came down toward him from somewhere above, carrying with it the first hint of open night, and his legs, so heavy only minutes before, seemed to move now almost without him asking them to. He had walked this same passage before, though never in this direction, and never at this speed, and the strangeness of that thought stayed with him even as his legs carried him forward. Back when he had still been the hero, he had walked down this same corridor more times than he could count on the crown's business, to sit across from men the palace had decided were traitors and ask them, patiently, to explain themselves. Now the same flagstones led the other way, up toward a door and, past it, toward whatever the world looked like for a man who was no longer supposed to be alive in it. Somewhere above the stairwell, faint enough that he almost decided he had imagined it, Haruto caught the sound of a night bird calling, an ordinary, unbothered sound from a world that had no idea what was happening just beneath it. Behind him, back down in the cell block, he could hear the sounds of the fight continuing, dulled by stone and distance into something almost gentle, a scrape, a low grunt, the clatter of a dropped blade. He made himself keep walking, one hand trailing along the cold wall for balance. The iron ring of keys still gripped in the other, though there was no longer any lock left for it to open. Once, only once, he let himself look back over his shoulder and saw nothing but the dark mouth of the corridor behind him. No shape of a man following. No sound of footsteps catching up. For a moment he thought about going back, and even took half a step in that direction before the same flat voice from a minute before seemed to speak again somewhere in his own head, telling him to keep walking. He told himself that Kenji had always been the strongest of them in a fight like that, stronger than the count of enemies would suggest, and that this was simply one more fight Kenji would win the way he won everything, without much drama about it. He told himself this several times. In fact, in the rhythm of his own footsteps, the way a person repeats a comforting thing until it starts to sound less like a hope and more like a fact. It did not quite work, and some part of him, the part that had spent 11 years learning to read the odds of a fight before it started, already knew better. But there was nothing useful to be done with that knowledge. Not there, not then, with the others already moving ahead of him up the passage toward the door, and so he carried it quietly and kept walking. Haruto would think about that stretch of corridor for years afterward, longer than he thought about almost anything else from that whole strange chapter of his life. He would remember the weight of the keys and the sound of his own breathing and the particular color the torchlight made on wet stone when a person is running from something they cannot look at directly. He would remember, too, that he never once heard Kenji raise his voice that night, not in anger and not in fear, right through to the last flat sentence spoken through a cell door. Kenji had said that he had never broken a promise in 11 years, and it was true, as far as Haruto ever learned, right up until the promise he made in that doorway. He did not come, not that night, not the next morning, not at any of the places they waited for him afterward, hoping for longer than was really sensible that a man that's stubborn simply could not be stopped by one guard and a short blade. In the seasons that followed, whenever the road grew quiet and there was nothing left to do but walk, Haruto found himself doing the same small arithmetic, turning the odds over and over as if a different answer might come out of it this time. One guard, one short blade, against a man who had once waded a flooded river with another grown man tucked under one arm and barely seemed to notice the current. And still, each time, the numbers came out the same. It never did. And eventually he let the arithmetic go. The way a person eventually sets down a stone they have been carrying too long. Not because it has grown lighter, but because the arms simply will not hold it forever. In later years, when Haruto let himself think of it at all, he came to feel that there was a kind of mercy in how plainly Kenji had said it. No drama, no farewell speech, just a flat, ordinary voice telling him to go. It meant that the last thing Haruto ever heard from him was not fear, and it was not grief either, but something closer to the quiet certainty of a man doing one more necessary chore before the end of a long day. That, in the end, is what Haruto chose to carry forward from that corridor. More than the fear or the running, the plain, unbothered voice of a friend keeping him safe without once making it sound like a sacrifice. In the years afterward, whenever someone new asked him about the scar he never fully explained, or about why he never once complained about carrying his own bags on a journey, he would tell them, briefly and without much drama of his own, about a warrior named Kenji, and about a door that stayed open just long enough. He found, in time, that the telling itself had become its own small comfort, a way of letting the man be remembered as exactly what he was, unhurried and steady, rather than only as an absence at the end of a corridor. The others. He had not let himself use that word since first light. Not since the cell 2 doors down had emptied and the straw in it had stayed undisturbed through every hour after. But the passage did not end at a door. It bent, and it opened, and it let them out into the yard where the scaffold stood. And there she was, ahead of him under the open sky, her sage's robe torn at the hem, on legs that did not look like they much wanted to hold her. Yui, alive. Someone ahead of him had reached her first, and whoever had been set to stand watch beside her through that long cold day was no longer standing anywhere at all. She had stood beside that scaffold since morning. She told him later, in the flat way she told him most things, while men she had never met argued somewhere above the stairs about whether to take them one at a time or all together, and whether the forms were in order for either. A whole day of it. A whole day of him listening at the bars for a sound that never came, and the reason underneath had been a scribe's and sign page, a question of tidiness. Haruto did not call out to her. His throat would not do it, and some part of him was afraid that if he said her name aloud the whole night might turn out to be something he had built in the dark out of wanting it too much. He only walked, and she was there, and the sky was open above him for the first time in a great many weeks, and for now, that is where this part of the story can rest. Let that settle for a moment, the way it was nothing more asked of it right now. You do not have to hold on to every detail. Just let the feeling rest where it landed, soft and unhurried, while the night keeps turning slowly around it. The story is not finished with them yet, and it does not need a rush to get there. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. The thread stays right where you left it, and it will still be there in a moment, a little further on in the same quiet dark. Take a slow breath in and let it go even slower. There is nowhere to be but here, drifting gently forward with them into what comes next. Somewhere beneath the palace, a door that should never have opened had opened, and now a man named Haruto was running across a long stretch of pale stone flooring. A woman named Yui just behind his shoulder, and he was still blinking against the sudden width of the night sky after so many weeks with only a slit of window to measure the hours by. Their wrists still carried the marks of the irons that had held them, faint red lines that would fade in a week or two, though neither of them was thinking of that now. Yui had trained since childhood as a sage, the kind of quiet calling that asks a person to spend a whole life thinking of other people's wounds before her own. And even now, mid-flight, with her own wrists raw and her own breath ragged, some old habit in her kept glancing sideways at Haruto to see how he was holding up. It was simply who she was. The stone under their feet was worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps, servants and soldiers and kings, and it felt strange. Haruto found himself thinking that his own bare running feet should be the ones to cross it like this, at a dead sprint in the middle of the night. Down in the cell, the air had always smelled of damp stone and old iron, and Haruto had almost forgotten what an ordinary night could smell like, cold and clean, with something green somewhere underneath it that might have been grass, or might only have been hope. It was a small thing to notice in the middle of running for his life. Behind them, deep under the palace, a cell door hung open on a broken hinge. The shouting that had started small down, there was already spreading upward through the stairwells, the way water finds every low place it can reach. Haruto did not look back at that sound. He had learned over the long years of the road that looking back at the wrong moment could cost a person everything, and so he kept his eyes fixed on the dark shape of the outer wall ahead, and on the woman running beside him, and on nothing else at all. The courtyard opened before them all at once, wide and flat and pale. Overhead stretched a sky crowded with more stars than either of them had really looked at in a long time. For one small moment, it felt almost like relief, the sheer size of the open air after so long spent underground. They did not feel like relief anymore. It was Yui who noticed first that a third set of footsteps, which had been keeping pace with theirs ever since the stairwell, had gone quiet. She slowed just slightly and touched Haruto's arm. He understood without a word what she meant, and the two of them turned together. Rin was standing a dozen paces behind them, in the middle of all that open stone, not running at all, her face turned up toward the sky, as though she had simply stopped partway across the courtyard to admire it. That was Rin's way, and it always had been, from the very first year the three of them had traveled together as companions of the hero. She had a habit of drifting off mid-sentence, of staring at clouds during councils of war, of answering a question a full 2 minutes after it had been asked. For a long time, Haruto had privately wondered whether some part of her simply lived somewhere else, in a quieter world of her own making, a place none of the rest of them could quite follow her into. But then a crisis would arrive, the kind that made braver people freeze where they stood, and Rin would come back all at once, calm and exact, and do something small with her store of magic that saved every one of them. This Haruto had come to understand over the years was simply how she was built. He had stopped questioning it a long time ago. Once on a bridge that had begun to give way beneath all three of them at once. Rin had done nothing at all for what felt like a very long moment, while the others called for her to move, and then, in the space of a single breath, she had done exactly enough to save them, no more, no less. She never explained how. She always seemed to know precisely how much was needed, and never spent an ounce more of herself than that. It was not a night any of them liked to talk about, though Haruto still thought of it sometimes, usually late, usually like this. Now, above the far wall of the courtyard, torchlight was gathering along the archer's gallery, a line of shapes taking their positions with the unhurried confidence of soldiers who had done this particular drill 100 times before. There were more of them than Haruto had time count. Rin looked at the gallery for a moment, and then at Haruto and Yui, and something in her face settled, the way a held breath settles once a decision has quietly finished being made. She said, without any hurry at all in her voice, that somebody was going to need to slow that many archers down for a minute or two. It might as well be her, she said, since her legs had never been the fast kind anyway. Haruto opened his mouth to tell her no. He did not get the chance to finish even the first word of it. Rin smiled at him then, the same faraway, half-elsewhere smile she had always worn, the one that had confused strangers and quietly comforted friends in equal measure for years. She told him gently that he needn't worry so much, that she was not going to die here, not tonight, not on some cold stretch of palace stone, because she was the hero's companion, she said, and companions of the hero simply did not end that way. That was all she said. It was a strange thing to hear, and an even stranger thing to believe, and yet in that moment Haruto found that he wanted very badly to believe it, the way a tired child wants to believe that morning really is already on its way. You did not say anything at all. She only looked at Rin for a long moment, the two of them sharing something private that Haruto was not quite part of, some understanding built slowly over years of watching each other's backs on roads far from here. Then Yui gave the smallest nod, as though some old agreement between the two of them had just been quietly renewed one more time. Rin turned back toward the archers, already murmuring the low, unhurried words of a spell under her breath, the way she always did, as if she had all the time in the world left to spend. She did not look at either of them again. And so Haruto and Yui did the only thing left that made any sense at all. They ran, and they chose to trust her, and they did not look behind them again. The far gate of the courtyard gave way to gravel, and the gravel gave way to a narrow track between old trees, the palace falling behind them tree by tree until its torches were only a pale smear against the dark. Haruto's lungs burned in a way he had almost forgotten lungs could burn. His legs had gone past, aching into something closer to numbness. But he kept moving because stopping was not a thing his body would let itself consider yet. Behind them, the night split open with a sound like the sky itself catching fire, low and enormous, rolling out over the treetops. Haruto risked one glance back over his shoulder, despite everything he had told himself about not looking, and saw that the clouds above the palace walls had turned the color of embers, glowing steady and red where Rin's magic had reached them. For just a moment, before he made himself look away again, the whole sky above the palace looked almost beautiful, the way distant fires sometimes do from far enough away that a person can forget for a single breath what is actually burning. Shouting rose from the gallery, rough and confused, the particular noise soldiers make when a fight has stopped going the way they expected it to. He could not tell from that distance whether the voices belonged to men falling back or men falling. He chose, for his own sake, to believe the first. The forest around them smelled of wet bark and old leaf fall, a smell that had nothing of the palace in it at all, and Haruto found some small, useless comfort in that, in the plain ordinariness of a smell that belonged only to trees and rain and nothing to kings or gallows. It was not much, but out here tonight, it was something to hold on to. A cold feeling moved slowly down the length of Haruto's spine, the kind that had nothing at all to do with the night air. He found himself thinking, not for the first time that night, that he should have stayed behind in her place, that it should have been him standing there instead of her. It was his name the kingdom wanted after all his crime, or what they had chosen call a crime, that had put every one of them in those cells to begin with. But Rin had already decided otherwise, in her quiet, faraway way, and there was no arguing with a decision Rin had already made. There never had been, not in all the years he had known her. So he ran instead, one foot and then the other, the trees closing in tighter around the track, roots catching at his ankles in the dark. Yui ran beside him without a word, her breathing ragged, one hand pressed flat against her side where an old wound from some other year still complained on nights like this one. Neither of them spoke of what they had just left behind. There was no breath left over for speaking, and some things Haruto had learned are easier to carry a little further before a person sets them down and looks at them properly. The shouting behind them thinned, and thinned again, swallowed by distance and by the trees, until it was only the memory of a sound rather than a sound itself. The glow in the sky faded slowly from ember red to a duller, smoke-colored gray, the way a fire does once it has burned all the way through whatever it was given to burn. Haruto did not know what that meant. He told himself, in the small, stubborn voice a tired person uses to keep walking, that it did not have to mean anything yet. They ran until the palace was nothing behind them, but a shape they remembered rather than a shape they could still see. Then they ran a little further after that, because fear does not end the moment the danger falls out of sight. When at last the ground began to rise and the track narrowed further still, Haruto felt Yui's steps slow beside him and understood, without needing to be told, that her body had simply reached the end of what it had left to give that night. He slowed with her. For the first time since the cell door had broken open, the two of them came to a full stop. They stood together under the black canopy of the trees, chests heaving. The forest around them had already gone back to its ordinary night sounds. Insects, small rustlings low in the undergrowth, and somewhere far off, one patient owl. No archers came through the trees behind them. No lights showed between the trunks. Just the dark and the cold, and the two of them breathing. Yui asked quietly, in the voice of someone who already suspected the answer and did not much want to hear it confirmed, whether Haruto thought Rin would find them again once the road curved back toward wherever it was they were going. Haruto did not answer for a long moment. The honest answer sat cold and heavy in his chest, and he did not want to hand that particular weight to Yui, not on top of everything else she was already carrying tonight. So instead he told her what Rin herself had said, that she was the hero's companion, and that companions of the hero did not end their story on Palestone. He said it slowly, the way a person repeats a thing carefully in the hope that saying it well enough might make it a little more true. Yui was quiet for a moment, turning that over. Then she said, softly, that she chose to believe it too, not because she was certain of anything anymore, but because there was nothing else useful a person could do with a night like this one except choose. And so, under the trees, with the cold of the ground finally reaching up through their tired legs, the two of them let that small and proven belief carry them a little further into the dark, the way a single candle carries a person the length of a long hallway. Not because it lights the whole house, but because it is enough, just barely enough, to see the very next step. They did not speak again for a while. Above them, through gaps in the black canopy, the same crowded stars they had seen back in the courtyard were still there, patient and indifferent, and somehow steadying all at once. The way stars always are to people who have nowhere else steady left to look. Haruto let himself watch them for a moment, and did not try to make himself feel better than he did. Somewhere behind them, a courtyard had gone quiet in a way that could mean almost anything, and somewhere ahead of them, a whole world still waited that neither of them had the strength left tonight to think about. That for tonight was where this part of the road came to rest. Let that moment rest now, exactly as it was, without hurrying it forward into anything more. We stay with them a little longer in the quiet that follows, letting the feeling settle the way still water settles after something has passed through it. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. Nothing here needs to be watched in order to continue. The night goes on unhurried, and so does the story, carrying itself forward the way a slow river carries a leaf, without effort, without urgency. Take a slow breath in and let it go. There is no rush at all. We simply continue on together into what comes next, still within this same night, this same story, still gently unfolding. In a dark forest west of the capital, a man named Haruto ran without looking back, and just behind his shoulder, doing her best to keep pace, ran Yui, the sage who had walked beside him for 11 years. They had come out of the tunnels beneath the old execution yard less than an hour before, and the shouting that had followed them through the first stretch of trees had thinned now into something quieter, which frightened Haruto more than the shouting ever had. He kept waiting to hear Kenji's voice somewhere behind them, that big, blunt laugh he used whenever he was hurt worse than he wanted anyone to know. It was the same laugh Haruto had once heard right after a spear went clean through Kenji's shoulder. And however hard he listened for it now, he kept not hearing it. He kept waiting, too, for some sign of Rin, for that particular hush in the air that meant she was somewhere nearby, murmuring some old word under her breath to buy them a little more time. There was nothing of the kind, only the sound of his own boots and Yui's lighter ones falling unevenly on the wet leaves. The forest here was not the tidy kind, not the sort with paths and signposts and a bench for tired travelers. It was scrub and bramble and half-fallen birch, the kind of forest that existed for no one in particular, that had never once considered that two exhausted people might someday need to run through it in the dark, tripping over roots that seemed to reach up out of simple bad luck. Low branches caught at Haruto's sleeve and let go, caught and let go a small, repeated violence he barely registered anymore, the way a person stops noticing rain after the first mile of walking in it. His legs had stopped reporting to him properly somewhere near the river crossing, and he had the strange, almost funny thought that they belonged to someone else now, someone slightly less tired, who had quietly agreed to keep running on his behalf. He found himself counting his own footfalls without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, the way a person counts sheep in the opposite direction of sleep. It occurred to him, in the small, useless part of his mind that was still capable of thinking useless things, that he had no idea what number he would need to reach before any of this started to feel survivable. The sky above the canopy still held a little of the red that Rin's spell had put there not long ago, bleeding slowly back toward the ordinary gray of a spring night. Every time he glanced up at it, he thought of her hands, of the small, careful gestures she made before any working of magic, and made himself look away before the thought could finish. He had known Yui since she was barely more than a girl, sent to the temple to learn a healer's trade, and he a boy with a sword too big for him and a title he had never once asked for. It was strange, he thought, running through a wood in the dark with a woman he had known for 11 years, that some of his clearest memories of her were the smallest ones, not the great healings or the battle she had steadied him through, but the ordinary evenings in between. The exact, unhurried way she used to fold bandages before she ever touched a wound. The small line that appeared between her eyebrows when a spell was not going quite as she wanted it to, and the patient, unbothered way she forgave him over and over for choices that had cost other people dearly. He remembered, too, a night years ago when his feet had blistered raw on some forgotten mountain road, and how she had knelt without a word of complaint and treated them by firelight, humming something low and tuneless, and told him afterward, laughing softly, that a hero's feet were still just feet. She had a way of listening to a person's whole trouble without once making about herself. And it occurred to him now, absurdly, in the middle of running for both their lives, that in 11 years he had never once properly thanked her for that. Yui's breathing had changed somewhere in the last quarter hour, gone from the deep, working rhythm of someone pacing herself to something shallower, something that caught a little at the top of each breath. Haruto slowed without deciding to, and glanced back, and found her closer than he expected, close enough that he could see the sweat at her temple catching what little moonlight came down through the branches. She managed a small, apologetic smile when she caught him looking, the kind of smile a person gives when they don't want to be a burden to anyone. And it broke something in his chest a little, quietly, the way ice breaks on a pond that no one happens to be standing on at the time. He asked her, in a low voice, whether she needed to stop and rest even for a moment. And she shook her head before he had even finished asking, as though rest were a kindness meant for other people. They came, after a while, into a wider clearing where the scrub thinned out and the trees stood a little farther apart, tall and dark and entirely unbothered by any of it. The kind of trees that had been standing long before any king had built any wall to keep magic in or people out. It was here that Haruto finally slowed to a stop, chest heaving, boots sinking slightly into ground gone soft with old rain, and turned to look for her properly, finding her a few steps behind him, one hand braced against a birch trunk, shoulders rising and falling too fast. For a moment, neither of them said anything at all, and the forest around them seemed, for just that moment, to hold its own kind of quiet, the insects gone still, the wind not quite reaching down through the canopy to where they stood. He watched her get her breath back the way he had watched her do 100 small, patient things over 11 years, and she looked back at him with an expression he had trouble naming, something not quite fear and not quite calm, sitting somewhere close to both. The cold had settled properly into the clearing by then, the kind that came up out of the ground itself rather than down out of the sky, and Haruto felt it through the soles of his boots and along the backs of his hands, a small, honest discomfort that felt almost restful after everything else the night had asked of him. It was in that stillness, the two of them simply looking at each other in a clearing that did not know or care what either of them had done or failed to do, that Haruto let himself think, just for a moment, that they might actually be safe. He would remember later how ordinary that thought had felt, how it had arrived without any drama at all, the way a held breath sometimes lets go before a person has properly decided to let it go. Yui's eyes on his were steady now, steadier than her breathing, and there was something in them that he understood without needing her to say it aloud, as gratitude, or something close enough to gratitude that the difference didn't much matter to either of them in that moment. He did not see the soldier at first. It was Yui who saw him, or sensed him, some flicker of old training rising up through her exhaustion the way it always did when it mattered most. Her eyes moved just slightly, just past Haruto's shoulder toward the tree line behind him, and something in her face went very still, stiller even than the quiet already sitting over the clearing. Haruto turned to follow her gaze a half second too late and caught, between two dark trunks, the pale shape of a young soldier's face. He was a boy not much older than the one who would, in some other telling of this story, have worn Haruto's old title and carried his old, borrowed sense of purpose. A soldier whose name, Haruto would learn only much later, was Hiro, an archer sent out with the others to search the woods for exactly two people who looked exactly like the two of them, following orders that had, until this moment, probably felt like simple, distant work. Hiro already had an arrow drawn, and his hands, Haruto would remember for the rest of his life, did not look steady at all, which somehow made everything that followed feel worse rather than better. There was no shout, no order, no warning of any kind, only the small, ordinary sound of a bowstring released into the cold night air, a sound so plain and so brief that for half a heartbeat Haruto's mind simply failed to attach any meaning to it at all. He would remember it afterward in strange, small pieces, never as one terrible thing, but as several quiet ones laid end to end. The low hum in the air, the faint give in Yui's posture, the way her hand rose instinctively toward her side a moment before he understood why, and the look on her face that was not pain, not yet, but a kind of soft, private surprise, as though her body had understood the news before the rest of her had caught up to it. She did not cry out. She swayed once, like a reed deciding whether to bend or break, and Haruto was already moving, already closing the small distance between them, though it felt, in that stretched, silent moment, like the longest distance he had ever crossed in his life. Longer, he would think later, lying awake with the memory of it, than any road in any of the countries he had walked across in the name of a war against something that had never once existed. He caught her before her knees gave fully, and lowered her down into the wet leaves with a care that surprised even him, given how little of that particular care he had shown, lately, to anything at all, including himself. Somewhere behind them, at the tree line, Hiro had gone very quiet too, as though he understood, in that same instant, exactly what he had just done, and had no idea yet what a person was supposed to do with knowledge like that. For a long moment, the forest simply held still around the three of them. The young soldier frozen at the edge of the clearing, the sage cradled in Haruto's arms, and the man who used to be called a hero kneeling in the leaves with no sword drawn and nothing left in him that felt anything like courage. Yui's breathing had gone shallow and quick, small clouds of it rising pale into the cold air, and her eyes, when they found his, were clear, unclouded by fear in any way he could recognize, fixed on him with the same steady patience she had always shown him. He would think, many times in the years that followed, about how she had looked at him in that clearing, about the particular color the moonlight had made of her face, about how a person could spend 11 years being cared for by someone quietly, without ever quite noticing the shape of it, and only truly understand the size of that care in the one moment there was no longer any time left to say so. The sky above the clearing had gone the deep, bruised color of a night, finally settling all the way in. The last of Rin's red long since faded into ordinary dark, and somewhere above the trees a single bird called once and did not call again. Somewhere far off, muffled by the trees, Haruto thought he could still hear the sounds of search moving through the wood, boots and voices thinned by distance into something almost gentle, though none of it seemed to matter very much anymore, not compared to the small, careful work of his hands, of holding her, of remembering every gentle thing she had ever taught him about wounds and bodies and the stubborn, quiet business of staying alive. Hiro did not step forward and did not run. He simply stood at the edge of the trees with his bow lowered now, watching, the way a person watches something they cannot undo and do not yet know how to carry, his young face pale in what was left of the light. Haruto did not look up at him. Not yet. Could not quite spare the part of himself that would have been needed to feel anger at a boy he understood, somewhere underneath everything else, well enough to almost forgive. For the first time since the trial had begun, since the sentence had been read aloud in that cold hall, since the long walk down into the dungeon that should have ended everything for good, Haruto was not running. Somewhere close by, a branch settled under its own weight and let go of a little of the day's rain, one slow drop at a time, and the sound of it was almost gentle enough to mistake for something ordinary, some other night, some other forest, some other two people who had nowhere in particular they needed to be. And in the strange, terrible stillness of that thought, he held Yui a little closer, one hand steady against her side, and let the forest around them go quiet, the way forests always do, eventually, no matter what has just happened inside them. Let that moment rest now, soft and unhurried, the way it settled into the quiet around it. There is no need to hold onto every detail. Let it drift, let it loosen, let it fold gently into the dark. The night is patient, and it is still cradling them, still moving slowly forward with them, the way a slow current carries something without ever rushing it. If your eyes have already closed, that is all right. The story does not need you awake to keep unfolding. Breathe slowly, in and out, and let your body sink a little heavier into wherever you are resting. We stay close. We do not hurry. And the same night continues to open around them, warm and unbroken, as we ease onward together. In the hush of a nameless forest, a man named Haruto held a woman named Yui close against him, her weight sinking into his arms with every stride he took. She was Yui, the sage who had walked beside him since they were both still young enough to think the world simple, and only a moment before, an arrow loosed by a soldier somewhere among the trees had found her. She had made no sound at all when it happened. It had gone in low, beneath her ribs, and her pale robe had already gone dark and heavy on one side, the way cloth does when it has taken on more than it was ever meant to hold. He would remember that silence of hers for years. He did not let himself look at it directly. He told himself, in the small, clear part of his mind that was still working, that if he did not look, it would not yet be true. The forest smelled of wet bark and crushed leaves, and under his boots the ground gave in soft, uneven patches, roots and moss, and the occasional stone, none of which he felt anymore. None of it mattered now. Behind them the woods were full of sound, boots on wet leaves, voices calling to one another through the dark. The whole ugly noise of men who believed they were hunting something dangerous. He hated every bit of it. He carried her past the black trunks and the low branches that caught at her hair, and he did not feel his own legs anymore. Only the fact of her breathing, which had gone thin and quick against his shoulder. Only that mattered now. He remembered, absurdly, a morning years before when she had scolded him for running through a forest much like this one, without watching where his feet landed, and he almost laughed, and then found that he could not. There was a clearing ahead, a small gap in the trees where the moon came through in one clean shaft, and it was there, without deciding to, that his legs finally stopped carrying him. It would have to be enough. He set her down as gently as his shaking arms allowed, her back against the roots of an old tree, and he knelt in the leaf mold beside her, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Her eyes found his in the moonlight, and even now, even like this, there was something almost apologetic in the way she looked at him, as though she were the one who owed him something. That, too, was so exactly like her. He pressed both hands over the wound the way he had seen healers do 100 times on 100 battlefields, though he had never once, in all their years of traveling together, needed to do it for her. It was not enough, and some part of him already knew it. She had always been the one who knelt beside the wounded, murmuring the words that closed a cut or eased a fever, her small hands steady even when his own were shaking around a sword. He wished, uselessly, that they could trade places now. He thought, in a strange, sideways way, of all the nights she had sat up mending some smaller hurt of his by firelight, humming under her breath while she worked, never once asking to be thanked for it. Now it was his hands that were useless, pressed uselessly against a wound too deep for pressing, and he felt something in his chest come apart very quietly, without any sound at all. He could hear, from somewhere behind the trees, the soldiers still calling to one another, closer now than they had been, their voices carrying strangely through the wet, still air, and he understood with a strange, flat certainty that there was no time left for either of them. There was no time left at all. Something old and simple rose up in him then, older than reason, the same instinct that had once made him step in front of a blade meant for someone else without ever considering it a choice at all. If there was no saving her, he found himself thinking, then there was no particular reason to save himself either, and the thought arrived not as despair, but as something almost like relief. It felt almost peaceful, and that frightened him more than the grief did. His lips had already begun to shape the first low syllables of a working he had never spoken aloud before, one of the oldest and cruelest kinds of magic, the kind that asks 2 lives instead of 1 and does not much care which 2 it takes. He had seen it once, years before, cast by a dying soldier on a battlefield already lost, and he remembered thinking at the time that it was the saddest kind of magic there was. He had pitied that soldier once. He had never once imagined that his own mouth would shape those same words, in a forest this quiet, for a reason this small and this enormous all at once. He was already forming the second word of it, his voice low and steady in a way that frightened him a little, when a small hand rose from Yui's lap and pressed itself firmly over his mouth. The spell died there, unfinished, swallowed back down into his chest along with everything else he had not said. It was over before it had truly begun. Her hand was smaller than he remembered it being, or perhaps it only felt that way now, cool against his lips and trembling very slightly, the way a bird trembles when it has been held too gently for too long. He did not try to move it away. He looked at her, and in the moonlight he could see that her eyes were wet, that a single line of tears had made its way down the side of her face while he had not been watching. She was dying, and she was crying, and even so her whole attention in that moment was fixed entirely on him, on stopping him, on making sure that whatever happened to her did not happen to him as well. He found the thought almost unbearable that a woman with only minutes left in the world would spend even one of them worrying about someone else's. He could not bear it, and he did not try to hide that he could not. It was so exactly like her that it made the grief in him twist into something closer to anger. Not at her, never at her, but at a world that would ask this particular kindness of this particular person and call it fair. Her hand did not move from his mouth, small and cold now against his lips, and she shook her head slowly from side to side, once the way she used to when he suggested something reckless on the road and wanted him to know, gently, that the answer was no. He understood her meaning without a single word being spoken, the way two people can after enough years of walking the same roads together in silence. She was telling him that his life was not his to spend so easily, not even here, not even now, not even for her. She had always been certain of that. He wanted to argue with her, the way he had argued with her 100 times before over smaller things, a wrong turn, a risk not worth taking. But there was no breath left in her for a debate, and he found there was none left in him either. There was nothing left to argue. She lowered her hand at last, slowly, as though it had cost her something considerable to keep it raised even that long, and let it rest instead against his cheek, light as a leaf settling onto still water. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than air shaped into words, and he had to lean close to catch all of it, his ear near her lips the way it might be for a secret rather than a farewell, her breath warm against his cheek for what he already knew would be one of the last times. She told him to go. She told him that the world beyond this forest was still waiting to be saved, whatever shape that saving finally took, and that she needed him to be the one who went and found out what that shape was. She said that she had followed him since they were both children with more courage than sense, and that she did not intend to spend her very last request on anything small. She asked him in that same worn, gentle voice to remain her hero all the way to the end. Not the end of this night, but the end of whatever came after it, however far off that end might be. He tried to tell her that he could not do that without her, that whatever he had ever managed to be brave enough to do, he had done it with her walking half a step behind him, ready to close whatever wound the bravery cost. He meant every word of it, but she only shook her head again, and there was something almost like a smile in it, faint and tired, the kind of smile a person gives when they already know they have won an argument they never meant to start. It was, in its own quiet way, still a kindness. She reminded him, in a voice growing quieter with every word, that a hero does not get to choose the parts of the story that are easy, only whether he keeps walking through the parts that are not. He felt her hand grow lighter against his cheek, not gone, not yet, but lighter, the way a held object feels just before it is finally set down. He held very still, as though stillness itself could slow anything down. Somewhere behind them a voice called out again, nearer than before, and a second voice answered it, and the sound moved through the trees like water finding the low ground. He knew, in the small, clear part of his mind, that there was very little time left to decide anything, and that she had already decided it for him. The way she had quietly decided so many things for him over the years without ever once making him feel decided for. He pressed his forehead gently to hers, just for a moment, breathing in the last of whatever warmth was left in her, the faint scent of crushed herbs that always seemed to linger in her sleeves no matter how far they traveled. He told her, in words that came out rougher than he meant them to, that he would go. He did not tell her that he loved her, not in so many words, because there had never been a need to say it between them. And this did not seem like the moment to start needing words for old, settled things. Some things had always gone unsaid between them, and had been understood anyway. She closed her eyes then, not all the way, but enough that the moonlight caught only a thin line of them, and her breathing had gone so soft that for a moment he thought it had already stopped. It had not quite, and some small mercy in the world let him have that last handful of seconds, her chest still rising, however faintly, against his own. He was grateful for even that. He made himself stand, though his legs did not want to carry him anywhere that was not toward her, and he made himself step backward, one step, then another, away from the clearing and the roots and the moonlight and her, away from the last quiet place the two of them would ever share. Every step felt like a small betrayal, and he took it anyway. He would spend a long time afterward, more years than he liked to count, wondering whether that walking away had been courage or only obedience dressed up to look like it. But in that moment, there was no room for the question at all. Only her voice still sitting in his chest, asking him to go, to be her hero all the way to the end, however far off that end turned out to be. He ran then, because it was the only thing left that he knew how to do, his feet finding the dark ground almost on their own while the rest of him stayed behind in that small clearing under the trees. Behind him he heard, faint and then fainter, the soldiers reaching the clearing at last, their voices dropping into something lower and less certain once they found only a young sage there, and no one else left to chase. He did not look back. He had promised her that much, without either of them ever saying the words aloud, and it was, in the end, the smallest and hardest promise he would ever keep for her. The forest closed and soft and dark around him as he ran, the moon slipping behind the branches overhead, and somewhere far off an owl called once and then went quiet, as though even it understood that the night deserved to be left alone. The forest kept its silence, and so, in his own way, did he. He carried her request with him from that night onward the way another man might carry a scar, something that never fully closed but that he learned, in time, to live around. Be her hero to the end, she had asked him, and though the world he walked into after that clearing would teach him harder and stranger lessons than he had ever expected, he would find, again and again, that he could not quite bring himself to set that promise down. And so, quietly, he never did. Let that moment rest for now. There's no need to hold on to it too tightly. Some feelings settle better in the quiet than in words, and this one can simply stay where it is, folded gently into the night. We stay with them a little longer, breathing the same slow air, letting the hush of the room close softly around what just happened. Nothing here needs to be resolved all at once. If your eyes are growing heavy, that is all right. Let them close for a moment. Let your breath slow. The night is patient, and so is this story. It carries on quietly from here, the way a house settles after a long day, the way a heart settles after it has said what it needed to say. Rest now, just a little before we continue. Somewhere along a lonely mountain road, a hooded traveler named Haruto walked with a slow, even pace, keeping his face turned down and his hood low so that no one in the village ahead would look at him twice. It had been years now since anyone had called him hero, years since he had slipped out of a kingdom that wanted him dead, and these days he told innkeepers a different name, one that meant nothing at all. Below him, the road curved down into a huddle of lantern-lit windows at the foot of the pass. Smoke rising thin and gray from a dozen chimneys into a sky the color of a fading bruise. He was tired. Not the kind of tired that a night's sleep could fix, but the older, deeper kind, the kind that had settled into his shoulder somewhere around the second winter of his wandering and never quite left. His boots were wrong for this cold, and had been for a year now, patched twice over at the toe, with leather he'd traded a mended kettle for, and still he had not let himself buy a new pair because a hero with a fine new pair of boots was the kind of small detail someone might remember. In every town he passed through now, Haruto had learned to do one thing well, and it was not fighting, though he still remembered how, and it was not healing, though the sage had once tried to teach him a little of that too. It was listening. He sat in corners. He ordered the cheapest stew on offer, ate slowly, and let the talk of the room wash over him the way rain washes over a roof, catching only the words that mattered and letting the rest run off somewhere he didn't need to follow. Because somewhere out there, scattered across kingdoms that no longer knew his real face, were the people who had once been foolish enough to call themselves his companions. And he needed to know, even now, even years later, what had become of them. It was a small, quiet hunger, the kind that never announced itself, and it had walked beside him longer than any single pair of boots ever had. That evening, in the common room of the mountain village, the fire was built up high against the cold coming down off the pass, and the talk drifted, as it so often did in places like this, from the harvest to the roads to news that traveled slower than either. Someone by the hearth was telling, in a low and practiced voice, the story of the false hero, the traveler who had lied about the demon king and dragged good people into ruin over it. Haruto kept his eyes on his stew. He had heard some version of this story in every town for years now. The way you hear the same folk song reworded a little differently in every valley. The melody always recognizable, even when the words had drifted far from anything true. Usually the story stopped there, with the hero and his so-called companions cast as traitors who deserved whatever the crown had decided for them. And Haruto had trained himself, by now, to let that much pass over him without so much as a flicker in his face. But tonight the voice by the hearth kept going. It was said that one of them, the woman who had traveled with him, the one the stories simply called the sage, though Haruto still thought of her, quietly by her true name, Yui, a name none of these tellings ever seemed to remember, had been made an example of before the end, paraded through more than one town, so that people could see what became of those who kept faith with darkness. Made an example of. Haruto did not ask what that meant. not out loud, because a wandering mender of pots does not ask sharp questions about old scandal from a war-fought seasons before he arrived. But inside his chest something went very still and very cold. The way a room goes still and cold when a window is left open through a long winter night. He had heard the word humiliated once before, whispered in a border town 2 winters back by a pair of women scrubbing wool in a stream. And he had told himself then that it might mean nothing more than a public trial, a shaved head, a walk through a jeering crowd. He had wanted badly for that to be all it meant. He had built a whole small, fragile shelter out of that hope, the way a person builds anything out of hope with whatever thin materials happen to be lying nearby. Sitting in that mountain tavern now, hearing it a second and then a third time, in a different kingdom, from a different voice, he understood that it had likely meant a great deal more than that. And he did not let his mind finish the thought, because some things a person cannot carry all the way to the end and still keep walking afterward. He found himself wondering more than once that night what kind of people needed a crowd for a thing like that. Monsters, in all his years of hunting them, had never once needed an audience. A wolf did not gather other wolves to watch it feed. A raiding beast did not care whether anyone approved of its hunger. It simply hungered, and then it was finished. But this had needed a town square and banners, and a crowd standing close enough to smell the fear. And somewhere in that crowd, he did not doubt, someone had been smiling. He thought, not for the first time on this road, that he had spent his whole young life hunting something called a monster, only to learn, far too late, that the only monster in the entire story had been wearing a crown and calling itself justice. It was a strange kind of grief, the grief he carried for her now, because he had no grave to visit and no name he could say aloud in most kingdoms without a guard's hand finding his shoulder. So instead, he carried her the way a person carries a smell from childhood, or a snatch of an old song, something that arrived unasked for and then simply would not leave. He remembered, more than anything, the small, ordinary kindnesses, the way she used to break her own bread in half without being asked and hand a larger piece to whichever of them looked most tired that day. He remembered that she had a way of listening to people, really listening, the kind that made even a rude stranger feel, for a moment, like the only person in the world worth paying attention to. He remembered, too, the particular way she used to hum without noticing she was doing it. Some tune from her temple days, half under her breath while she bandaged a blister or boiled water for tea, as if her hands and her voice had never quite finished agreeing to work together. That was the woman a kingdom had decided to make an example of in a town square in front of a crowd. Some seasons later, deep in a stretch of old forest where the road narrowed to little more than a deer path between ancient trees, Haruto made his camp for the night the way he always did now. A small fire, his back against a trunk, and no one else for company but the sound of the leaves. By then the story of the sage had traveled far beyond the borders of the kingdom, where it began, and Haruto had heard it told in half a dozen shapes, each one a little different. The way water wears a stone a little differently, depending on which way it flows. In one town, they said she had been a witch who deserved everything that came to her. In another town, someone claimed she had wept and begged at the end, which Haruto knew with a quiet and total certainty, could not be true because begging had simply never been in her. In another, quieter town still, an old voice by a different fire had dropped low and said that plenty of common folk had wept for her that day, though none of them dared say, so where a guard might hear it. Haruto held on to that second version more tightly than he probably should have, the way a person holds onto the one kind sentence in a room full of unkind ones. It did not change what had happened to her, but it meant that somewhere in some corner of that frightened kingdom, a few ordinary people had looked at what their crown had done and known, quietly, in the privacy of their own hearts, that it was wrong. That was as close to comfort as the world seemed willing to offer him these days, and Haruto had learned, slowly, to take it without asking for more. The fire popped once low, and somewhere off in the dark a night bird called twice, and then thought better of it. He thought sometimes, too, about the two companions who had never made it out of that night at all, and supposed that their ends had likely not been gentle either, though the rumors never seemed to reach quite that far. Mostly, though, his thoughts came back to Yui, because hers was the story the world seemed to want to keep telling over and over in market squares and mountain taverns at forest camps just like this one. He wondered, some nights, if that was its own kind of unkindness, that a kingdom could not even let her rest quietly in whatever ground they had put her in, that they needed her story told and retold as a warning to keep everyone else afraid. And some nights, he wondered if it was the opposite, if perhaps it meant she was not so easily forgotten after all, that somewhere in all that retelling, some small true thing about her kept surviving despite everyone's best efforts to bury it. He did not know which of those two things was true. He was no longer sure he knew which of anything was true. Not after everything. Not after learning that the very monster he had spent his boyhood hunting had never once existed at all. He pulled his cloak tighter and let the fire burn down a little more. And for a long while he simply sat with it, the not knowing, the way a person sits with an ache that has been there so long it has started to feel like part of the body. Later that night, long after the fire had burned down to a soft orange bed of coals, Haruto climbed a little way up the ridge above his camp, high enough that the trees thinned and the whole dark valley opened out beneath him like something poured slowly from a jug. Somewhere out there, past more borders than he could name, were kingdoms that believed a hero had slain a demon king who had never drawn breath, and a sage who had never existed the way their stories told it, a woman made of nothing now but rumor and warning. The stars over that valley were the ordinary kind, unbothered by any of it, scattered the same way they always were, and Haruto found a strange, thin comfort in that, in the fact that the sky at least had never once lied to anyone. He knew the truth, and the truth was smaller and sadder and far more ordinary than any of it. A girl who broke her bread in half, who listened like no one else could, who had asked him, right at the very end, only to go on being her hero to the last. That was all any of it had ever really been. Not a war between good and evil. Not some great battle for the world. Just a handful of frightened young people doing as they were told, and a kingdom that could not forgive them for finding out the telling had been a lie. Haruto sat down on the cold stone of the ridge, drew his knees up the way he used to when he was small, long before anyone had ever handed him a sword, and let the wind move through the grass below him without trying to make it mean anything. If humans could do what had been done to her and call it justice while they did it, then he no longer knew what separated them from the monsters he had once been sent to kill, except that the monsters at least had never pretended to be anything other than what they were. He breathed out slowly. There was no answer waiting for him on that ridge. No voice from the valley to tell him he was right or wrong to feel the way he felt. Only the wind and the coals dying slowly behind him and the long shape of the road still ahead. So he let himself grieve her a little longer, quietly, the way he had learned to do in 100 small towns by now, without tears he could afford to let anyone see, and without a grave to kneel beside. And then, because there was nowhere else for the grief to go that night, he simply let it settle, the way heavy things settle at the bottom of still water, and turned his thoughts instead toward morning and the next stretch of road and whatever quiet town waited at the end of it. He would keep walking, he decided, the way he had decided every night for years now. Not because the walking fixed anything, but because a person has to put his feet somewhere, and the road at least had never once lied to him about what it was. Somewhere behind him, in some ground he would probably never find again, the truth was still lying quiet, patient enough to wait. And for tonight, that quiet, unfinished patience was the closest thing to peace that Haruto had, and he let it carry him, at last, down off the ridge and into a thin and dreamless sleep. Let that moment rest now, just as it was, without needing to be finished or explained. Some feelings are like that. They don't resolve so much as settle quietly into the part of us that keeps them safe. We can stay with them a little longer, if you like, breathing slowly, letting the weight of it soften at the edges. There is no rush here. The night is still wide open ahead of us, patient and unhurried, and the story is only pausing to breathe alongside you. If your eyes are growing heavy, that is all right, let them close. The rest will still be here, drifting gently forward, carrying the same warmth, the same quiet thread into whatever comes next. Just rest a moment. We'll go on together, softly, whenever you're ready. In a castle at the end of a long, moonlit road, a weary man named Haruto climbed the last worn step and came, at last, into the hall where legend said the very first hero had slain the very first demon king. The road here had taken him longer than he liked to remember, past the empty villages and the burned bridges, and he had told himself, more than once, that he was only going to see the place with his own eyes. His feet ached in a way that had stopped meaning much to him many months ago, and the hem of his cloak was still damp from the last river he had crossed, though he could no longer have said which river it was, or how many like it had come before it. Somewhere far behind him, more days than he cared to count, were the roads he had walked as a much younger man, roads that had felt, at the time, like they were leading somewhere other than here. The doors were taller than any door had a right to be, and they stood open, the way doors stand open in places nobody bothers to guard anymore. Inside, the air smelled of cold stone and older dust, the particular dust that settles over a room once everyone has stopped coming to visit it. Moonlight came down through a gap in the high ceiling and lay across the floor in one long pale stripe, and Haruto stood at the edge of it for a while before he let himself step in. He had expected, somehow, to feel something enormous in this place, the birthplace of the whole old story. And instead he only felt tired, the way a man feels tired at the end of a story he already knows. There was a throne at the far end, its arms worn smooth, its cushion long since rotted away to threads, and it was, he noted without much surprise, entirely empty, and had been for a very long time. He let his fingers rest for a moment on the stone arm of the throne and found it colder than the rest of the room, the particular cold of something that has never once been sat in with any warmth. Dust hung in the pale stripe of moonlight, turning slowly, the way dust turns in a room where no door has opened in a long while, and he watched it for longer than he meant to. No bonus, no chance, no great black shape slumped in the dark, waiting for a hero brave enough to end it. Just a chair in a room, gathering dust, in a castle that generations of songs had built into something it had never once been. Haruto walked the length of the hall slowly, his boots loud in a way that embarrassed him. And along the walls he began to notice the plaques, small brass things, one after another, each engraved with a name and a pair of dates. He had assumed, walking in, that there would be one plaque for one hero, the first and only one the songs remembered. There were dozens. He crouched at one point in front of a plaque set low on the wall, its letters gone soft and green with age, and traced the shape of a name with one finger the way a man traces a name he cannot quite bring himself to say aloud. Above it, a newer plaque, the brass still faintly gold beneath the dust, and above that another, and another climbing the wall like rungs on a ladder nobody had ever finished climbing. He went along them with his fingers, the way a man reads a wall he does not want to be reading, and the dates went back further than he could easily account for, decade folding into decade, name after name after name. Some of the plaques had been polished at some point, cared for, and others had gone green and unreadable, forgotten in their turn the way everything in this hall seemed eventually to be forgotten. It was the pattern in the dates that undid him more than any single name. Each hero's plaque ended a few years after it began, and beneath a great many of them, in smaller letters, someone long ago had carved the same word, over and over, the word for a person the kingdom had decided, in the end, to call its enemy. He tried, for a moment, to count backward through the dates, to work out how many years, how many decades this hall had quietly been doing what it did, and gave up somewhere past the second century of them, because the number had stopped being able to tell him anything true. He understood, standing there with his hand flat against the cold brass, that he was not looking at a hall of victories. He was looking at a hall of endings, the same ending, repeated for longer than anyone alive would admit to remembering. Every hero who had ever come this far, it seemed, had eventually stood exactly where he was standing now, and found exactly what he had found, an empty throne and a lie with no one left to blame for it. And every one of them, faced with that emptiness, must have done one of two things. Either they had gone home and told the truth the way Haruto himself once had, and paid for it the way his companions had paid. Or they had understood something that Haruto was only now standing in this cold and moonlit hall, beginning to understand himself. Whoever first told the story of a hero and a demon king could not have known, surely, what they were building alongside it. A slow and patient machine that would go on manufacturing exactly what it needed for as long as anyone kept feeding it heroes. A kingdom that needs a monster does not stop needing one simply because the monster turns out not to exist. It only waits patiently for someone to become one. He thought of the sage and could still see her face if he closed his eyes, the particular calm she wore even in the worst of it, and the way she had always tucked her hair behind one ear before she spoke, as though a small tidiness might hold the rest of the world in place. He thought of the warrior and could still hear his laugh, too loud for most rooms, the kind of laugh that had gotten them both scolded by innkeepers from one end of the kingdom to the other, back when scolding was the worst thing either of them had to worry about. And he thought of the mage, and could still hear the low, unhurried words she had murmured under her breath as she turned back toward the archers, in that quiet, faraway way of hers, as though she had all the time in the world left to spend. None of them had lied. None of them had run. And the kingdom had answered their honesty with a scaffold, because a truth that says there is no monster is a truth no kingdom in the middle of being afraid can afford to hear. So the kingdom did what kingdoms in this hall, it seemed, had always done, which was to look at the last person who knew the truth and quietly decide to make him the monster instead. Haruto let out a long breath he had not known he was holding and watched it curl white for a moment in the cold air of the hall. He was still standing near the throne, his hand resting on its worn stone arm, when he heard from somewhere behind him the small definite sound of a boot finding the top step. He turned, unhurried, the way a man turns when he has stopped being surprised by anything, and in the broken doorway, framed by the same moonlight that had led him here, stood a boy with a sword already drawn. The boy could not have been more than 18, and he wore the crest of the royal house stitched neat and proud across his chest, the way it is stitched onto every young sword sent out from that palace, with a purpose already chosen for it. His name, though Haruto would only learn it properly a little later, in the long quiet that came after, was Sora. His breath came a little too fast for someone trying to look calm, and his knuckles, where they gripped the hilt, had gone pale with how tightly he was holding on. Behind him, through the broken doorway, the mountains stood dark under a sky gone the deep, soft blue that comes just before true night, and somewhere far off a bird Haruto did not recognize called once and went quiet. He held the blade the way boys hold blades when they have trained for years and fought for none, correct in every particular, and trembling only slightly, only where no one had taught him yet how to hide it. And in his eyes, catching the moonlight the way still water catches it, there was a light Haruto knew well, because he had once carried the very same light behind his own. It was the light of a young man who has been told, clearly and kindly, and by people he trusts, exactly what is wrong with the world and exactly what he must do to fix it. It asks no questions of itself. It has not needed to yet. Haruto remembered, with a tenderness that surprised him, what it had felt like to carry that same certainty up 1,000 roads just like this one. He thought, standing there in the moonlight with an unarmed hand still resting on the throne, that he could try to tell the boy everything. The empty hall, the brass plaques, the long silent arithmetic of names and dates along the wall. He could turn and point at the throne and say, "Look, there was never anything here. There was never anything here for any of them. Go home." He waited there in the cold hall, the way a man weighs a coin he has flipped so many times already that he knows, before it lands, which way it wants to fall. He thought of the sage's small shake of her head in the trees, telling him with her whole body not to bother, not to try, that the truth would not be permitted to survive contact with the world twice in one lifetime. He thought of the kingdom's answer to honesty, delivered in brass, name after name after name, all down this hall behind him, and of how telling the truth had never once, in all those names, saved a single one of them. And he understood, with a calm that felt almost like relief after so many years of running from it, that the truth had already been tried by better people than himself, and it had not saved anyone. It had only ever bought the next name for the wall. So Haruto did not reach for the truth. He let it go, the way a man finally sets down a weight he has carried further than he needed to. There was no thunder in it, no flare of dark light, nothing a bard could later shape into a verse. Only a tired man in a cold room, quietly deciding to stop fighting the shape the world had already carved out for him. It felt, if anything, like setting down a pack he had carried too long, the straps worn so deep into his shoulders that their absence, for just a moment, ached more than their weight ever had. A kingdom that requires a monster in order to feel, for a while, brave and safe and whole, will always find a way to manufacture one, whether or not the old stories were ever true to begin with. Someone was always going to stand in this hall on this particular night, wearing whatever shape the fear required of them. It had been the sage's turn and the warrior's, and it would tonight quietly become his own. He straightened, and something in the way he held his shoulders changed, not in a menace, not in anything the boy in the doorway would have called violence even afterward, but into a kind of stillness that filled the whole ruined hall the way cold water fills a cracked jar. If the boy needed, tonight, to have crossed half a kingdom to end a demon king, then Haruto decided, there in the moonlight, that he would rather be given to him honestly than argued away from him and left to wander, hungry into someone else's story. It was, he thought, the last true thing a hero could still offer a world too frightened to hear the truth. Not the truth itself, just the mercy of a shape to aim it at. He did not raise a weapon, and he did not step toward the boy, and nothing in that hall so much as stirred the dust on the floor. He only let the years show, the sage and the warrior and the mage and all the small brass names on the wall, until the boy in the doorway, watching, felt something ancient settle over the space between them. Haruto looked at him then the way a man looks at a mirror he has not stood in front of in a very long while, and there was no anger left in it, only a kind of tired, familiar recognition. And very quietly, without ever raising his voice above the hush the moonlight seemed to ask of the room, He told the boy to come ahead. Then, since he had come so far already, and he asked him, in the same soft and unhurried voice a man might use to ask an old and simple question he already suspected he knew the answer to. Which of the two of them, in the end, standing in that hall of empty thrones and brass names, was the real Demon King? The boy did not answer. Boys rarely do at first. Far below the castle, the villages Haruto had passed on his way here would already be settling into sleep. Mothers pulling blankets over children who would grow up, in their turn, on songs about a hero and a demon king, never once knowing how many hands the story had passed through to reach them. Outside the broken ceiling, far above them both, the moon went on quietly crossing a sky that had watched this same hall, this same question, asked and asked again, for longer than either of them would ever know, and it did not stop to watch this time any more closely than it had the last. And that, perhaps, is where the story rests for tonight, in a cold stone hall at the end of a long road, with one more name about to be added to a wall that was never really short of room. And so, tonight's story comes to a close. The voices fade, the rooms grow quiet, and whatever was carried through this telling can finally be set down and left behind. If you have made it this far, still listening, still here, thank you truly for letting this story keep you company through the dark hours. There is something quietly precious about spending a night like this together, even in silence, even from a distance. Now let the rest that follows be deep and unbroken. May your breathing slow, may your thoughts soften and blur, and may whatever dreams come to you tonight be gentle ones. And when morning finds you, may it arrive slowly, kindly, without hurry. A soft light through the curtains, a few extra minutes before the day asks anything of you. This story ends here, but the nights keep coming one after another, and there will always be another waiting whenever you need one. If you find your way back here on another night, more stories will be waiting, ready to keep you company the way this one did. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let everything else wait until tomorrow. Good night.